banks. President Teddy Roosevelt was under pressure to take drastic action and was forced to ask for the help of a man he despised, J.P. Morgan. But this powerful banker had his own ideas as he watched the panic from the windows of his towering office. In November of 1910, the heads of the most powerful banking institutions in America boarded a private railroad car in New Jersey for a 1,000-mile journey to Jekyll Island in Georgia. The bankers were told to come to the station separately and not to acknowledge each other in public. Even after boarding the private car, they were told to address each other by first names only. It was important that no one, not even the servants on board the train, be allowed to know their last names. The destination was Jekyll Island, a private retreat for multimillionaires, away from reporters and prying eyes. The purpose was to participate in one of the most clandestine meetings in all history. Secrecy was so important that the regular staff had been replaced by temporary servants who would be unlikely to recognize the faces of these men. Now, at last, 10 days at Jekyll Island reveals what went on at that secret meeting and how it changed America forever. 10 days at Jekyll Island literally were 10 days that shook the world.
Make long story short, when I was over in Europe and we had dealt with some of these, I came back from this trip where the big Canaanite altar had been done, and I just had been gone for 3 months. That whole trip was a 3-month ordeal, and I was ready to make a beeline home and take some rest. And my wife and children had been over with me for part of it. They had come back to Oklahoma, and I was missing my family. I just wanted to get off the plane, and I had a car in New York because my brother lives there, and we had drove out there to visit with him and some friends. And I just wanted to make a beeline home in my car and not stop for anything but gas. When I landed in New York, the Holy Spirit said to me, I know you want to get home. I know you're missing your family. But I need you to do one more thing before you go. And he said, the timing is important. Before you go back to Oklahoma, go down to Jekyll Island, Georgia.
Jekyll Island.
And I said, Lord, I don't even know, I knew something about Jekyll Island. I had looked at some of the financial issues in the 80s and 90s. I was looking at some of the spiritual applications to financial things, but I really was not up to speed on the history of Jekyll Island. I had just heard it from something. I'd not even read, the book that's called The Creature of Jekyll Island. I'd not even read that book, but I was aware of something about Jekyll Island and financial stuff. So I went in my brother's house, got my computer out, and I just, got on the internet and typed in Jekyll Island, and it's like, what's going on with Jekyll Island? And was praying and asking the Lord, why do I need to go there? And he said, when you get there, I will explain to you what you need to do. But he just told me, he says, go to the island and plan to spend. It's not that far from New York, but he said, I need you to tarry for a day or two and listen to me. I'll tell you what to do. So I discovered when I got online that the Jekyll Island Club, which was this historical, multi-millionaires country club that had been built in the turn of the century, it had just been remodeled and reopened. And I thought, wow, that's interesting. And immediately the Spirit of the Lord said, that's where I want you, book a room there. And so I just booked me a room for that night, then got in the car and headed that way. All the way down there, I'm driving and I'm praying, and I don't like. I know when the Lord tells me to do something like that, I have to obey. At the same time, I'm one of these guys that I don't like doing anything alone. I don't think God sends people alone. I think He often wants us to go in twos or threes, right. And I'm not afraid to go alone. But it's just like Lord, where's my little buddy Leahu? Where's my, there's got to be something important, or God would not be diverting me. And I don't know anybody in Jekyll Island, so I'm thinking, who do I know in Georgia that I can call? Maybe there's somebody that can come over and join me. And I just was complaining a little bit. It's like, Lord, I'm tired. I've been gone for a long time. I'd really rather be going home. What's so important about Jekyll Island that I got to go there now? And the Lord just encouraged me. He's like, son, please don't complain. I don't ask you to do something unless it's important. I'm directing your steps, and this must be done now. So I quit complaining and grumbling, and I just started praying and cheering up. And so I tried to just pray in the Spirit all the way down there. When I got to the hotel, it was about 9 o'clock at night. And one of the things that I've learned is that whenever God's doing something territorially, He almost always has someone on site that's ready to open the door to Him. Mm-hmm. I call them gatekeepers. In Chronicles, David ordained 4,000 gatekeepers as king, and we need to understand that anointing a little better. That's another story. But I often come into a place, if it's the first time I'm there, and I'm asking, Lord, connect me up with who you already know or who you got your hand on that's able to open the door to your spirit and what you want to do. And so I expect God to order my steps, and I try to go with my ears and my eyes open, looking for the local that God has His hand on. And they're not always hard to find if you're praying that way. So I walked into the hotel, and the lady behind the desk calls out my name. She says, "Are you Mr. Bentz?" And I said, "Boy, you're really good at your job," because I hadn't said anything yet. She said, "Well, you're the last one to check in. I just kind of figured that you must be Mr. Bentz." And so it was just a little bit of an exchange that was odd. It was not a normal way to start a conversation on her end. I was a little bit impressed that she was up to speed on her job and she knew who I was. So I asked her, I said, do you look at all the names? How did you know I was the only one left? And she said, well, I was actually here last night when you booked your reservation. I assigned you your room last night. So I realized that you had not checked in yet, so I was looking for you. So I said, well, okay. And then she got this real funny look on her face. And I know that kind of looked like she's sitting there like she wants to say something else but isn't sure if she should. And I asked her, I said, I'm here for a real interesting purpose, and if you know something else, please tell me. She goes, no, I don't. I'm not sure I should say it. And I said, no, I want to hear it. So I looked at her and I said, look, I'm a spiritual man, and I believe God's doing something with me, and I need to be here, but I don't know why I'm here. So I looked at her and says, you work here. You live in this area. Why am I here? And she said, well, I did hear something really strange when I booked your reservation, but I don't have that kind of experience very often, so it's uncomfortable for me to say it. I said, well, please tell me just whatever you know. Don't worry about it. I experience this kind of stuff all the time. She said, well, I was sitting in the office and I was booking the reservations, and when your reservation came in over the internet, I assigned you your room. I said, well, that's not unusual. So what did you do? What made that different? She said, well, I heard this voice inside me, and that's never happened to me before. I said, what did you hear? She said, I heard this voice said, he's an ambassador. I'm sending him. Give him the presidential suite. And she looked at me. She says, are you a real ambassador that's kind of incognito or something? Because I looked up your name, and you're not an ambassador of a country. I said, I kind of laughed. I said, I'm not an ambassador of a nation that you understand, but I was sent by the Lord Jesus. He's the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, and the word ambassador is one that's sent on an errand. I'm representing him. I am here to represent him. And I said, he's the one that's important, that's coming on your hotel site, not me. And she said, well, I gave you the presidential suite. But I was kind of thought it interesting what I heard, because that's not normal for me to hear something like that. And so I said, do you know Jesus? Do you know the Lord as your Savior? And she said, yeah, I believe in God and I believe in Jesus. I just don't hear like that. You know? So I said, well, did you hear anything else? She said, yes, as a matter of fact, there was one other thing. I heard that I needed to give you the presidential suite, that you needed to be here for 2 nights, not 1. So I booked your reservation just like you asked for it, but I've also reserved you for another night. And I did that without pay. I'm applying your payment to both nights. So you're getting the presidential suite for the price of 1 night, for 2 nights. And she said, I heard that I needed to introduce you to the gentleman that is in charge of our museum on the island, and a few others that work here at the hotel that have lived here most of their lives. I said, okay. That sounds like you heard a word from God. And don't ever be afraid of that. Listen to his voice and let him lead and guide your steps. And thank you very much for telling me. You know, this is going to be fun. We're going to figure out what he wants to do. And I had no idea that it would relate to some of the other things, but I just thought that was so much fun. It was like one minute I'm feeling alone, another minute it's like God's already got somebody on site that's hearing him and obeying him. Even though it was her first time to have an experience like that, she was obeying what she heard. That's what's critically important when we're doing spiritual warfare. It's not just to run into the battlefield and try to take down the demons, but it's to hear and obey. So anyway, it was 9 o'clock. She texts me in and she tells me, we'll take care of your bag. We'll have the valet park your car. She said, your room includes supper and breakfast, and the restaurant's only open till 10, so if you want to, go right on in there and get you a meal. We'll get your stuff up to your room, and you can go up there in a little bit. And then you need to come down sometime before 10 o'clock and have your breakfast. And so I went in the restaurant and had a good meal, and went to my room and got some rest. And the next morning I went down for breakfast, and a different lady was at the desk, but she had a note for me and said that I had an appointment arranged with the museum director, and that he was blocking out most of the day to spend with me. So I had my breakfast, and then when I went over to meet with him. Again, I'm just there. I don't know personally yet why I'm there. I'm just hearing and obeying what I do know. But I'm rested and I'm well fed and I've been taken good care of, and the presidential suite was fabulous. And it was like, Lord, why did you give me this? I didn't ask for it. I didn't ask for a special VIP treatment. Why are you doing this? So when I asked the lady at the desk, the one that I had met the night before was not there, so I said, this is a pretty nice room, what you guys put me in. And she looked at me, she goes, no one has stayed in that room since 1948. It's been totally remodeled. You're the first guest that actually has stayed in there since it's remodeled. She said, the last person that stayed there was the actual president. And I thought, well, that's interesting. So I'm sitting there just pondering the idea of that, not getting caught up in the luxury of the room, but just thinking, what is it about that room that God was wanting to invade? And thinking it's not about me having a nice king-size bed and some luxury. It's about him coming in and doing something himself. Why did he need the presidential suite? Why does he want to do something in Jekyll Island? And those are the way I'm questioning and praying. So I go meet with the museum gentleman. His name was John, and when I go meet with him, I just introduced myself. I told him a little bit about who I was and what I do. He was not a very spiritual guy, so he respected it, but he just kind of told me right off the bat, you know, I don't really understand prayer and intercession, that kind of stuff. He said, I believe in God, but I'm not very spiritual. And I said, well, that's okay. You're still important. There's something you know that I need to know. And I said, I don't know if you'll understand it, but the King of Kings set this appointment up. There's something you know I need to know. And I'll pray for you, and I'll pray for the business here, and I'll pray for whatever it is that God wants, but just please attend to this as something very, very important, you know, and thank you for your time. So we started talking. He was, of course, started out talking about the financial stuff, because this Jekyll Island is where the Federal Reserve banking system was birthed and conceived. And at one time, when it was functioning in the 1900s up to the 20s and 30s, some say 1/3, some say 2/3 of the world's wealth would vacation on that island. Mm-hmm. It was the highest conglomeration of wealth in a single place very often anywhere in the world back in the turn of the century. So it just seems like a little island that's not anything significant at all now, but it's amazing to see the financial side of the history of that spot. And so I'm sitting there looking at some of the things that he's telling, and just thinking about some of the things he's telling me. We went out and walked around, and he showed me some of the cottages that had been restored, and the club itself, and the tennis courts, and you know, they had a pier where the boats would come up, and he's just kind of showing me the grounds, and then we go to the museum. And he's talking a lot about the financial stuff and the guys that built it, and each cottage was, you know, marked and named. Some of them had been restored, some of them didn't exist anymore, but they had like a sign that this is where this one was, and that one was built by J.P. Morgan, that one was Rockefeller's, and, you know, that one was... they had each one of them named. Well, they're all kind of native names, and then they're all, you know, got some kind of a plaque on who the financial mogul was that had built them. And they're not really elaborate, luxurious mansions. They're just simple cottages for the most part, which was kind of interesting to know that the richest people in the world built them, and they were very low-key and almost like a, you know, cabin in the woods instead of a luxurious house like you'd expect. And they all had Indian names. So I started asking him about the Indian history of the island, and he lit up. He just was like, that's what he really wanted to talk about, because he loved the Indian history. And so he takes me back to the museum, and he said, we got a lot of stuff on the Indians. He said this was actually like the government main community for a tribe of Indians that don't exist anymore. That tribe was called the Timucas. And I said, well, that's interesting. My name's Tim. And anyway, I didn't know anything about the Timucas. I'm from Oklahoma. I've learned a lot of Native history, and I have some Native bloodline, but I did not know anything about the Timucas. So I just asked him, please tell me everything that you can tell me about them. There's something about the natives that I feel like I need to know. So he said, well, the Jekyll Island Club was actually built on top of everything that the Indians had. So they just kind of wiped the village out and built the club on top of it. So wherever the chief's house was, there was a cottage now. Wherever the council house was, there was now the Jekyll Island Hotel. You know? And he said everything that's built and visible today is actually sitting right on top of something that was significant in the Indian village when it existed. So he said the fact that this whole place had to go into ruins and then be rebuilt and become an archaeological state park, he said, it actually helped us identify the Native history because the club itself had almost erased that. You know?
Hmm.
And so I said, well, let's look at the museum. I want to see some of the Indian stuff. So we're looking at arrowheads and spear tips and, just artifacts that they had found and pottery shards and things and seashells that they had had. And he showed me all their stuff in the museum. He shows me some fragments of a weapon that was like an unusual bow. And when I say unusual, I mean that it was like a double curved bow. And that was a very unusual shape of a bow for a native tribe. I had never seen that shape before with an American Indian tribe. And I've seen a lot of bows and arrows. So I asked him, I said, this seems unusual. I've not seen this before. In Oklahoma, every native tribe, the bows would look like a single bow or just a single curve. I said, this is quite extraordinary, especially as far back as this tribe was. So he said, yeah, we found a lot of weapon-type artifacts that we've not seen with other tribes. And I said, well, how do you know these were Native Americans? Maybe they were from somewhere else. He said, oh, no, they were the Timucua because they're well established along the Florida and Georgia coast, and he said we got a lot of stuff in 3 or 4 states about them, and they were quite prolific at one time. So he said, we know they're Native Americans. I said, well, all right, what else you got? He said, well, we got some skeletons. He said, you want to see the bones? And I said, well, yeah. That sounds, you don't get to see a skeleton very often. I said, are they where we can actually see them, or are they buried? He said, no, they're visible. So they had a burial site that they had been very respectful for when they built the museum. When they found a burial site, they didn't move the bones. They left them where they were, and they just uncovered them to where they were visible, and then they built the museum on top of it. They did basically the same thing with the museum that the Jekyll Island guys had done with their houses. They put a piece of plexiglass over the burial site so you could see it, but they were still trying to respect where the bones were and not move them. And so I'm looking at 4 skeletons of the Timucua chiefs. And they knew they were chiefs just from different things that were buried with them. So all of a sudden I look and I realize, man, these guys are really tall. And I commented to the guy that, how tall are these guys? They look unusually large. And he said, yeah, they're all about 8 or 8.5 foot tall. I was like, well, that doesn't seem like a normal Native American, especially the tribes that I'm familiar with. He said all the Timucuas were unusually tall, even the women. And he said we found other skeletons and parts of bones out in the grounds, and he said we got pretty good evidence that nearly all of them were extraordinarily tall. And I said, well, what is how do you explain that in relation to other tribes on the Atlantic coast who were not? He said, I don't know. It is an unusual anomaly. He said, oh, by the way, I've got a painting that you might want to see. It's actually the copy of the original. We've got it under lock and key. But he said, I got a painting that actually shows the Indians from a group of French colonists that came to the United States before it was the U.S. This was right after Columbus. He said that it was the first colony of French folks that came over to try to establish a colony on the coast. And he said they landed in Jekyll Island, and they had some interaction with these Indians, and then they got so appalled by what they saw and witnessed that they fled at night and ended up in San Augustine, Florida, and established that city. So I said, were they the Huguenots who were the French group that established San Augustine? He said, yes. I said, well, I'd like to see that painting then. So he pulls that out. I'm looking at it, and it shows the Indians and all their regalia, and they're dancing around and having some kind of ceremony, and it's got the fire, and it's a typical, either they're having a party or they're having a war scene, and it has some things with the weapons. So I said, gosh, this has got some weapons in it that clearly validates the archaeology that they found. And then I see an altar. And I'm going, I don't know of a Native American tribe anywhere in the country. I know some that had log houses or high places or worshipped, nature in some way, or had totem poles or that kind of stuff. But this one has a stone altar, and it looks a whole lot like the one that I had dealt with in the Middle East. And I'm looking at the picture, and I'm going, is this an altar? Is this stone like something they're sacrificing on? Because this guy's holding babies in his hands in this picture. He said, yeah, they're cutting those babies, they're hacking those babies up in that painting. And so when you look at the details, two of the shamans or chiefs are holding a baby up by the ankles, and they're whacking their heads off and spilling the blood on this altar. Mm. And I'm like, sir, I don't want to be disrespectful of your training and archaeological understanding and history, but I don't know of any native tribe that did what I'm seeing here, unless it was an act of war. And this is really, really unusual. And I've seen this type of scene with artifacts over in the Middle East. And I've seen weapons like this over in the Middle East. I said, are you sure this is Native Americans and not some kind of colony that came from over there? And he was convinced they were Native. And I said, well, I'd like to show you some things on a few websites that identify artifacts in the Middle East countries, and especially Egypt and Israel and Syria and Jordan area, and some of those spots where there's some of these ancient groups. And I said, this type of altar, this type of religious ceremony, and some of these weapons, I've seen them before over there. Well, he was quite interested in that because he loves Native American history, but he's starting to question, maybe I need to dig into this more. That was his comment. So I said, at that point, then I thought, I believe this is why I'm here. I needed to see this and hear about this. At this point, I'm not that concerned about the financial stuff anymore. I'm wanting to know, where is this altar? And so I asked him, I said, can you take me to this altar? I often pray over these things, and it's very beneficial for the land and for the country and for the people. Can I go to this altar and see it? He said, I can take you to the altar, but you can't see it. And I said, why can't I see it? Is it buried? He said, no, it's not buried, but it has a house built on top of it. I said, who would be crazy enough to build their house on top of a blood sacrifice altar? He said, well, Rockefeller was. So,
nice.
Okay, can we go there? And he said, yeah, it's just a short walk. Come on. And we've actually, I'd already walked by it. So he said, I've got the keys. He said, normally nobody can go in. The way these things are set up, they're historical homes now. The state of Georgia owns the park. They lease it out to another group, the hotel, to run, but the houses are maintained on the National Historical Register, and they're part of the state park. So you can't go in any of them without a guided tour or permission, but you can go look in the windows and walk on the porches and walk all around them. And they're set up inside just like they were when they were actually being used back in the 20s and earlier. So we go over there, and he's got the keys, though. So we go into the house, and he takes me into the parlor, and he says, well, I know you're a praying guy, so you probably would like to have a little time to pray. He said, you're standing right on top of the altar right now. This is the room that is built on top of it. He said, I'm just going to go over here and sit down for a few minutes and read the newspaper, and I'll let you pray and do whatever you need to do.
Now, this parlor, that's where those guys, J.P. Morgan and all those guys, actually conceived of the Federal Reserve, right? Right over that altar.
That's exactly right. It's the room that they were sitting in when they drew up it that became the Federal Reserve Act.
Wow.
So this was the conception of the Federal Reserve banking system on the parlor sitting on top of a blood sacrifice altar.
Where babies were sacrificed.
Yes. And so all of a sudden it's like, wow, no wonder our banking system has so much corruption in it, even when people want to do the right thing, you know.
No kidding.
And so, just being a banker is not an easy job, but it's like, not all of them are bad guys, but it's like, wow. And that was not what our founders set up. That took over. It usurped the authority of the way our founding fathers suggested that we bank as a country. And even the way it was passed had a lot of, things that didn't seem right about it. But the idea that it was conceived like this, I'm going, this is not just a bunch of wealthy guys that got away for a vacation and came up with a profitable business plan. This has got something diabolical, something occultic about it, something evil that's wrapped up with it.
Yeah.
And so even if it had been a good idea and something beneficial for the country, which many would argue that it was, this demonic power must have gotten into it. That's what happens when an altar is not dealt with. That's what happens when God's people do not do spiritual warfare the way He tells us to.
Right.
Then we all become subject to it, because they didn't just create a bank, they created a banking system that every one of us have become subject to. So think about this. You've got money that you receive as a ministry, or that when you earn, I'm sure you tithe and give offerings. On your money is idolatry. It's printed right on your money.
Right.
And you're using that money. You're coming into the house of God, and you're laying that idolatrous coin or dollar bill on God's altar and saying, I'm giving you this as an offering.
Wow.
What if the living, holy God hates it?
Wow.
We don't have a choice, because we're subject to it.
Yeah,
it's
that's why they call it circulation, because that's exactly what we're doing. We're circulating a talisman that has evil attached to it right from its conception.
Is it possible, now I'm not saying thus saith the Lord here, but is it possible that a lot of the financial blessings and a lot of the things that God has promised His people, and that we're supposed to be the head, not the tail, and we're supposed to be, we ought to be running the world in a righteous, holy way, not ruling over people in a mean way, but just bringing wisdom to every single industry.
Right.
I think it's real possible that the reason why many people in the body of Christ struggle financially, even when they're doing God's perfect will, even when they're walking out their ministries as best they know, is because we're forced to do business with something idolatry, and we must be bringing a stench before God's eyes when we give Him an offering with it.
Wow. That's why He says that, I don't want your offerings. I want everything we do. I mean, from eating to living and electricity. I mean, everything we do costs money. I mean, we're trapped in an evil system.
That's what I'm saying, that we've become subject to it against our will. Either we didn't resist and say, no, we don't want that. We didn't elect our representatives to represent us correctly, because they deviated from righteous wisdom when they passed this bill to allow idolatry become the circulated means of exchange. And the fact that we are subject to that says there's something wrong in the land, not just something wrong with our hearts. There's defilement in the land, and then there's defilement in our hearts. And All right, now, to relate that to Scripture in one way, without deviating too much from the story, because I want to tell you the rest of the altar part, but when I was in Israel the last time, I was studying out with some of the rabbis that I know that passage of Scripture on Jesus turning over the tables. And I was meeting with some Orthodox rabbis, but they were respectful of the fact that I believed that Jesus is, or Yeshua is the Messiah, and I asked them some hard questions. And they asked me some too. But one of the questions I asked them was, why did Yeshua need to turn over the tables at the temple? What was going on? You know, I assumed, and had been told by other pastors and ministers, that they were probably cheating people at those tables. They weren't giving them a fair exchange. They were, using dishonest scales, and Jesus knew they were cheating, so he threw their tables over. I got quite a different answer from the rabbis. One of them pulled a coin out, and he said, "This is an ancient coin. I carry it around because it was minted here in Jerusalem, and it was discovered and found by a friend of mine when we came back to the land in 1948. It was found on the vicinity of the Temple Mount." And he said this was called a Jerusalem shekel. It was minted from the time of David all the way up to the time of the temple being destroyed in 70 A.D. Only it was changed once during that period. He said when David ordered coins to be minted, it had a menorah on it. But during the days of Herod, this coin had the same weight, the same, constitution. It was mostly silver, and it was a set weight exchange. But he said they changed the picture on it. It was no longer menorah; it was the face of Baal.
Yeah.
And so he had the one that had Baal's face on it.
Wow.
And I asked him, I said, you're a holy man. I can tell you love God with all your heart. Doesn't it bother you to carry that coin around? He said, yes, but that's why I carry it around. It reminds me how easy it is for Israel to become subject to idolatry.
Yeah. Us too.
Because he said it was priests that minted this coin with the face of Baal.
Wow.
And it was a wicked king named Herod who ordered us to do it. And it was Rome's influence that gave us a benefit for doing it by making it something circulating that would make us wealthy but not holy anymore. And so he said, and he said, I'm not going to try to tell you that I think Yeshua is the Messiah. He was pretty adamant that I don't agree with you on that. But I'm searching that out because my best friend lived his whole life trying to prove that that was not accurate, and he died telling all of us in this room that he had come to the conclusion that Yeshua was the Messiah. And because he was my best friend, I'm searching that out in the Scriptures now for myself. But he said, however, whether that's the case or not, historically, if that's accurate, what Yeshua did, he did Israel the greatest service when he turned those tables over. I said, I don't understand. What exactly did he do? He said, he said publicly, my Father's house is a house of prayer, but you've made it a den of thieves. He said, that phrase doesn't mean you're cheating people at the table. It means you're robbing men of their souls.
Wow.
He said the reason was because Herod required a temple tax, and the priests of that day were corrupt, and they required tithes and offerings and taxes to be paid. And the rules in Scripture was that whenever a census was taken, half a shekel for every male had to be paid, whether you were poor or not. And he said Rome required a census to be done every year so they could collect the tax. And so he said to pay that tax, you had to come into the temple and pay it with a shekel or a half shekel. And the only shekels that were allowed were ones with the face of Baal on it.
Wow. The face of Baal in the temple of Jehovah.
Yes.
Wow.
So Jesus was saying to the whole city that day, stop giving your money to these priests. Stop putting it in that offering plate.
Wow.
Don't do this anymore. You're robbing your sons and daughters of their souls because you're trying to bring something idolatrous in front of the face of a living God.
Oh, man. I mean, I've been saying that without even knowing what I'm saying, because this is what you're saying is new revelation for me. But I mean, I've been saying for over a year now that I hate carrying at least $1 bill in my pocket, because that's the whole thing is to Baal. It's Nimrod. I mean, I call them Nimrods.
Well,
yeah,
easy to get out of shape over it. I mean, it's really easy to get up. When you learn the truth, it's easy to just want to move somewhere else or want to just give all your money away. It's worthless anyway. And at the same time,
right.
But it's our means of exchange. What do we do? You know, I'm thinking about Psalm 11, when the foundations are broken, what do the righteous do? We have to repair the foundations in order to lay hold fully of the righteousness. And then it's not just in our heart, it's not just a hope or a desire, but it should become the law of the land, because it's good for everybody. It's not forcing something on others that's bad. It's giving them righteousness and peace and joy and freedom, which is what our country was established for. So I took note of that, and I'm sitting there at Jekyll Island suddenly, and the rabbi's words were ringing in my spirit, and I'm just weeping, going, Jesus, we've become subject to something evil. We're being robbed of our souls. Is this going on in your temple in America, like it was going on when you turned the tables over in the Temple Mount?
Yeah.
And the Lord just said to me, absolutely it is. And it's not just that, but it's got a blood oath and a covenant with something evil attached to it. And its evil design is to enslave you. And while I'm standing in the parlor, the Holy Spirit says these words to me. He said, son, are you free? I said, yes, I'm free because you made me free. He said, no, you're not. You're a slave. Because you have debt that you're not fully paid off.
Yeah.
And I said, well, yes, Lord, I know that, but, I'm not behind on my bills. I'm paying it, and I've asked you to clear my debts. I've asked you to help me get that done, and you've promised me you would. He said, I know, but you need to understand what's happening today, why this was so important, why I needed you to come here instead of go home. Because he said, right now, if I gave you the money to pay off all your bills and your house and your car and all your possessions and your credit card, if everything was paid off, would you then be free? And I said, yes, Lord, I wouldn't owe anyone anything but to love them. He said, you still wouldn't be free because you're a citizen of the United States.
Right.
Right now, at this day, you owe about $30,000 just because you're a U.S. citizen, even if your house was paid for and your cars were paid for and you had no other debt. You owe that money because you're a citizen and because your representatives have put that debt on you. And because the generation before you was more concerned about what they could have than they were about you as their child. I went, man, Lord, I didn't know the deficit was that much for every individual. And he said, well, what I'm about to do is to bring judgment to that, but you need to understand it's going to get worse before it gets better.
Ah, the government. It loves you and wants to keep you safe and well. It even wants to make paying taxes, fines, and court costs easier for you. How? Well, you'll need to meet your straw man. He was born the same day you were. He looks like you, has the same name, and lives in your house, but you never knew he existed. You will have even paid his parking tickets or taxes. The worst part? He's been dead from day one. From every birth certificate, a legal personality, or legal fiction, is created with the same name to confuse little old you into thinking it's you. So, there is a human you and a paper you, or as it's commonly known, a straw man. So when it seems like government officials, court clerks, or the police are speaking English, they aren't. They're speaking legalese, designed to make you agree to verbal and written contracts without even knowing about it, all spun from Black's Law Dictionary. For example, when the police say, "Do you understand?" you'll say, "Yes." What they are really saying is, "Do you stand under our authority?" Oops-a-daisy, you just created a verbal contract with them. Oh, you clever government. Did you know that whenever you register something, you are handing over title to the person you register it with? That's right. Whenever you register something with the government, they assume it belongs to them. Registered your car? Super! Now you are the registered keeper of your vehicle, and the government can crush it when you don't pay your, straw man's taxes. Expecting a new bundle of joy? Well then you need to register your little darling with a birth certificate. Then they can start the process all over again and create a new straw man for your little one. Isn't that great? So when Junior grows up, he'll be able to generate revenue just like you have. When you notify on your baby by signing the birth certificate, your child becomes a ward of state, and if the government doesn't like what you're doing, they'll assume it's okay to take the child away, or make new rules for things they don't like. Not enough school? Smacking your child? Shouting too loudly? Then it's off to social services for the little one. When you get a bill, it's sent to you, but belongs to your straw man, not you. That's why bills, fines, and summons start with Mr., Mrs., or Ms. Sometimes you'll see your surname in capitals, just like on a gravestone. That's because your straw man is dead, and just a silly piece of paper, created before you could comprehend or even consent to it. When you go to court, you represent your straw man, so you, the human, take on any costs, fees, taxes, and fines involved for the straw man. The human you doesn't even need to pay them. But you made a contract with the court by appearing on behalf of your legal personality or straw man, just like the government knew you would. Confused? Well, don't worry. The government doesn't want you to know anyway. If you knew, you'd stop paying things like council tax and parking tickets. Because when you go to court, you are representing your straw man. You are you, alive and made of flesh and blood. Your straw man, or legal personality, is a piece of paper created from your birth certificate. And you think it's you. What a silly Billy. Would you like to know more? Well then go over to tpuc.org.
Transparency in monetary policy is a goal we should all support. I've often wondered why Congress has so willingly given up this prerogative over monetary policy. Congress, in essence, has ceded total control of the value of our money to a secretive central bank. Congress created the Federal Reserve, yet it had no constitutional authority to do so. We forget that those powers not explicitly granted to the Congress by the Constitution are inherently denied to the Congress, and thus the authority to establish a central bank was never given. Of course, Jefferson and Hamilton had that debate early on, and the debate seemingly was settled in 1913. But transparency and oversight are something else, and they're worth considering. Congress, although not by law, essentially has given up all its oversight responsibilities over the Fed. There are no true audits. Congress knows nothing of the conversations, the plans, and the action taken in concert with other central banks. We get less and less information regarding the money supply each year, especially now that we don't even have access to M3 statistics. The role the Fed plays in the President's secretive working group on financial markets goes essentially unnoticed by Congress. The Federal Reserve shows no willingness to inform Congress voluntarily about how often the working group meets, what action it takes that affects the financial markets, or why it takes these actions. But all these actions directed by the Federal Reserve alter the purchasing power of our money. And that purchasing power is always reduced. The dollar today is worth only 4 cents compared to the dollar that the Federal Reserve started with in 1913. This has significant consequences on our economy and our political stability.
What is the proper relationship, what should be the proper relationship between a chairman of the Fed and a president of the United States?
Well, first of all, the Federal Reserve is an independent agency, and that means basically that there is no other agency of government which can overrule actions that we take.
You are 5 brothers. I want you each to start a banking business in a different country. One to go and open a house in Paris, one in Vienna, one in London. Choose the most important centers, so that when money is to be sent from here to London, let us say, you won't have to risk life and gold. Hampshire, here in Frankfurt, will just send a letter to Nathan in London saying, pay so-and-so. And that will be offset by loans from London to Frankfurt. You understand? Yes. In your day, there will be many wars in Europe. And nations that have money to transport will come to the Rothschilds.
Don't talk anymore, the doctor.
I'm giving advice to our sons, Mama, that the doctor cannot give. Remember, unity is strength. All your lives you must stand by one another. No one brother must be allowed to fail while another brother succeeds. Your 5 banking houses may cover Europe, but you will be one firm, one family, the Rothschilds.
Mr. Jones owned a cotton plantation and many slaves. One day he was talking to the owner of the plantation next to his, and Mr. Jones was lamenting the fact that times were tough. He was having to work his slaves harder than ever, and was having trouble with some of them being disobedient or trying to run away. The other plantation owner said he knew someone who could help.
Day 1.
One day Mr. Jones called his slaves together so a man named Mr. Smith could talk to them. Before beginning, Mr. Smith whispered to Mr. Jones, whatever I say, do not contradict me or interfere, and I promise you your slave troubles will end. My name is Mr. Smith, he said to the slaves, and this may be the happiest day of your lives. From today forward, you will no longer be slaves, but free men. Mr. Jones was so shocked he started to step forward, but Mr. Smith gestured for him to remain silent. He did, only because the other plantation owner had spoken so highly of Mr. Smith's skills. You are no longer the property of Mr. Jones, Mr. Smith continued. You are free. No more will you be forced to labor for the benefit of Mr. Jones. Now you can work for yourselves. Now the slaves were all murmuring and looking at each other. Many were smiling, many were looking puzzled. In fact, you are now free to leave the plantation whenever you want, Mr. Smith said. However, since we are surrounded by other plantations, if you leave, some other plantation owner will likely claim you as his own the moment you set foot on his property. So I urge you not to risk your newfound freedom by doing something so foolish. Instead, I suggest that you stay here, no longer as slaves, but as willing participants and part owners of this plantation. Yes, this is now your plantation. Mr. Jones bit his tongue to keep from objecting. For now, we might as well leave Mr. Jones in charge, said Mr. Smith, since he's the only one with any experience at running a plantation, which is quite a complicated thing to manage. But he will no longer be your master, but just another worker on the plantation. In fact, he will now be using his organizational and management skills to serve you. Whatever problems you may have had with him before, you are now all equals, and you need each other to make this work. If we all cooperate and work together, we can all reap the benefits together. In honor of this happy occasion, I present you this new symbol of togetherness and cooperation, this flag, which shall be the emblem of the new, free Jones plantation. He held up the new flag, but most of those listening were still too amazed to respond. And this shall be our motto, Mr. Smith announced. We work together as free men for our mutual benefit, pledging our allegiance to the Jones plantation, which stands for prosperity, liberty, and justice for all. To celebrate, everyone has the rest of the day off. Enjoy your freedom, do as you please, and be back here tomorrow morning, bright and early, so that we may begin work on this great and noble new endeavor as equal free men. Finding convinced that Mr. Smith was serious, the former slaves applauded and cheered.
Day 2.
We all want this plantation to do well, Mr. Smith said at the beginning of the next meeting, so we can all share in the benefits. We all know that it takes a lot of effort to make a cotton plantation work, Just because you're all free doesn't mean you can stop working. In fact, since you're now working for yourselves, I expect you to work even harder than ever before, but now with pride and joy, knowing that you're working for yourselves. Of course, there still have to be rules. If everyone just does whatever he wants, the plantation won't produce anything. This experiment will fail and we'll all starve. You should be thankful that Mr. Jones has agreed to stay on to lend his knowledge and skills to this endeavor, and I trust you will all do your own part to make this work. Several of you have been chosen to act as project supervisors to manage different aspects of the operation, to make sure everyone is doing his assigned job, to make sure that the rules are followed, and so on. The rest of you may head out in the fields to start your first day of work as free men.
Day 3.
The next morning, Mr. Smith. Yesterday, Charles was caught keeping some of the cotton he picked, presumably to sell for his own personal profit. That is against the rules. That is stealing. For that, Charles must be punished. 2 men tied Charles to a whipping post. I take no joy in this, Mr. Smith continued, but you must understand, if we do not maintain order, if we do not have rules that we all abide by, then the plantation will fail, and we will all suffer. The whip cracked against Charles' back. But if we all pitch in for the common good, then we can all prosper. Being free doesn't mean you should be selfish and greedy. We must each do our assigned duties and obey the rules, and then we can all benefit, and each of you will receive your appropriate share of the profits. A young man named Samuel stepped forward. But if you and Mr. Jones decide the rules and whip us if we disobey, how is that any different from what we had before? How can you say that? Mr. Smith asked. I'm shocked. You were a slave before, and now you're free. Things still need to be managed and organized by those best qualified to do so. Do you know how to run a plantation, Samuel? Well, no, he answered. But if we're free, why do we get no say in what the rules are and how things work? I'm surprised at your ingratitude, Mr. Smith answered. None of you know how a plantation is run, so you're in no position to be making decisions about how things are done here. You don't seem to appreciate all the things that Mr. Jones provides for you, from protecting you from all the outside threats that you know nothing about, those who would come here, capture and enslave you, if not for Mr. Jones' protection, to making sure that you all have food and housing, tools to work with, you're cared for when sick and injured, and so on. There wouldn't be a plantation at all, no cotton to pick, no land to plant and harvest, if not for him. You should be grateful that he's made possible the level of comfort you now have. Your lives would be far worse if not for him. Nevertheless, as free and equal participants in this endeavor, from now on at each meeting, any worker may have 2 minutes to ask questions or voice suggestions or complaints. With that, the workers all seemed satisfied and headed out again to the fields to pick the cotton.
Day 4.
I have a big announcement, Mr. Smith said as the daily meeting began. Mr. Jones' cousin is here, and not just to visit and see how our project is coming along. It's been decided that from now on, you will be deciding who will manage the plantation. Of course, this job can't be done by just anyone, but every 3 months we will have a special meeting at which all the workers will vote on whether we think Mr. Jones should run the plantation or whether we think his cousin, Mr. Johnson, should run the plantation. That means that ultimately you are in charge because you will be deciding which man you want running things on your behalf. If you don't like the way things are being managed, you now have the power to change it. Amazed and pleased, the workers headed out again to the fields to pick the cotton. Days passed, months passed, a year passed, and the plantation continued to operate as before. Sometimes Mr. Jones was in charge, sometimes Mr. Johnson was in charge, but the day-to-day routine stayed exactly the same. The workers worked hard, long hours every day, and still had little to show for it. Every day the meeting would begin with them all reciting the Jones Plantation motto, "We work together as free men for our mutual benefit, pledging our allegiance to the Jones Plantation, which stands for prosperity, liberty, and justice for all." One day Mr. Smith announced, "Samuel is asked to say a few words this morning, and whatever the rest of us may think of his ideas and opinions, we are all free here, and that means we are all allowed to speak our minds. So, Samuel, you have 2 minutes. Begin." Samuel stepped forward, looking scared. "I was excited when all this started," he began, glancing nervously at Mr. Smith and Mr. Jones. "But don't you all see what's happened here? Nothing's changed. We're all still slaves." There were grumbles of disagreement from the crowd. "They tell us what to do and whip us if we don't. They still make all the rules and punish us if we disobey. They let us make suggestions and complain about things, but they never really change anything. They let us choose between Mr. Jones and Mr. Johnson, but what's the difference? The situation stays the same. We do all the work and they take as much as they want and decide how much they'll let us keep. They live in luxury, made rich by the cotton we pick. We do all the work and have to build our own huts, grow our own food, and take care of ourselves. They leave us just enough that we don't revolt or run away. This is not freedom. We're all still slaves. They've only changed the words they use, but nothing else has changed. They say we're all free and equal, but we're not. They command and we obey. That's not freedom. That's not equality. They say we're free to leave, but all that means is that we're free to be someone else's slave. Why should we work or obey the rules? We didn't agree to this. They made the system. They forced it on us. They control and rob us and call it freedom. They've deceived you into thinking that being able to choose which slave master you'll work for is the same as being free. It's not. Open your eyes. If you keep what you produce, they call it stealing. When they take what you produce, they call it sharing and fair distribution. Can't you see that this is all your time? Ease up, Samuel, Mr. Smith announced calmly. At his gesture, two supervisors grabbed Samuel by the arms and led him to the whipping post. I'm sorry, Samuel, but you've broken the rules. There are rules against encouraging others not to work and encouraging others to break the rules. You're only hurting all of us with your discontentment and your complaining and your disobedience. The whip fell and Samuel let out a grunt. Without rules, without order, all would be lost. Without law, there would be chaos. We can't just behave as wild animals, each doing whatever he pleases. We must all follow the plan and all do our duty for the betterment of everyone. And those who do not must be punished. The whip fell again and blood flowed freely from Samuel's back. Samuel, it is you who are stealing from the others. When you don't do your assigned work, you are making more work for others. When you disobey the rules, it is you who are endangering the future of everyone else here. You are the thief. You are the criminal. You are the one trying to destroy the arrangement that keeps us all safe and prosperous. At every lash of the whip, the other workers cheered louder and louder, some yelling curses at Samuel. Being spoiled and selfish, you complain about everything, talking as if you're oppressed. But you are the one ruining things. You are the one keeping us from being all we could be. It is your greed and your rebelliousness that is hurting all of us. They all play by the rules, Mr. Smith said, gesturing at the others. What makes you think that you don't have to? You think you're above the law? There were loud yells of agreement as the whip fell again. We must maintain order, Mr. Smith proclaimed, to make this plantation great, to make it so that we can all be happy and prosperous. To have the society we want, there have to be rules. We all have to contribute our fair share to this great endeavor, and we cannot tolerate actions and attitudes that seek to undermine the amazing things that together as free men we have achieved and will continue to achieve. Mr. Jones was smiling as he gave Mr. Smith a pat on the back. The crowd was cheering so loudly that none of them had noticed that Samuel had died.